Let's welcome our speaker. John Livingston is the CEO of Verve. He leads Verve's mission to protect the world's infrastructure. He brings over 20 years of experience from McKinsey & Company, advising large companies in strategy and operations. John's committed to helping organizations find the lowest cost and simplest solutions for controls, data, and ICS security challenges. John, thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks to you, Dan. I really appreciate being here, and welcome to everyone to our webinar for today. I'm going to hopefully, okay. Dan, can you possibly make me a presenter to share my screen here? That would be great.
You should be all set.
There we go, beautiful. And hopefully everyone can see the screen as opposed to my face, or maybe with my face. Anyway, so as I said, thank you all for joining us here today to talk about OT security. Just by way of background, as Dan mentioned, I am the CEO of Verve Industrial. I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company, helping large organizations deal with the whole digital transformations that have been going on. And I left there to join Verve because of the issue and the concern that we had seen within the world of cybersecurity and how those transformations were going to potentially be disrupted by threats and attackers. Just by way of quick background, Verve has been around for almost 30 years now. Our team is composed of both IT folks as well as people from the OT, or quote unquote operating technology / industrial controls environment. And we spent about 12 or 13 years developing and deploying our platform that helps bridge this divide. Today is less about a discussion of Verve and our platform, and much more of an introduction to the concept of OT security and how people on the IT security side can leverage the capabilities and the historical effective approaches in IT security to achieve the same kind of results on the OT side. So in talking with Dan earlier, I realized we probably should start with just a definition of what in the world is this term we use called OT security. So first, what is OT? OT is short for operating technology. In this case, think of computers that control some form of physical process. Sometimes there are other terms used for OT. Sometimes you'll hear SCADA. Sometimes you'll hear ICS, or industrial control systems. Sometimes you'll hear cyber physical systems, lots of different names for basically the same concept. And those physical processes could be anything from power generation, manufacturing, pipelines, transportation such as rail, building controls, hospital medical devices, things that now are fancily called IoT, sensors and cameras. So it's a world of things that essentially somehow impact physical processes, physical environments, or physical safety and security. And then the second question is, okay, so great, that's what it is. Why are we even talking about this? Why is it really different? And we're going to spend more time on this topic, but at a high level, there's two, three, or four, or five kind of key differences. Number one, OS, the operating system devices, so the Windows, Unix, Linux type devices, while being similar to what we see in IT, they are different in the controls applications that are running on them. So in many cases, these systems have to be up 24/7, 365, maybe with an outage, in some cases every 2 years, some cases every year, but very, very high reliability uptime. Many of these devices, typically 70+%, are embedded operating systems, meaning they're proprietary to some OEM, Rockwell, Siemens, Honeywell, Schneider, various vendors. Very limited staffs, complex networking. So you've got many layers in many cases of network protections, not just from a security point of view, but just from operational reliability. And taking what we typically think of as IT endpoint actions are limited due to these sensitive systems. And we'll talk more about this, but it is a very different set of systems, set of processes, and approaches. So in one more double click on that, we think about IT versus OT, on the devices side, as I mentioned, many of the Windows type devices running these OEM applications, many old legacy systems, the typical OT system may last 20 to 30 years. And so you've got Windows XP, Windows NT in games, you've got PLCs that haven't been updated in 20 years. The software typically is running some form of proprietary, oftentimes, as I mentioned, older software. The infrastructure today is mostly on-prem. More and more of the IoT or Industry 4.0 type things are moving it to the cloud, but there will continue to be heavy on-premise infrastructure for many years to come, most likely. Most of these systems are unmanaged. So we don't apply, in most cases, organizations don't apply typical IT systems management in these environments. In many cases, it's separate organizations that own them. And they're not connected to traditional AD and other infrastructure. Remediation is different because of these systems. As I mentioned, if you've got a system that's running 24/7, patching, for instance, becomes quite challenging. The threat identification is also different. The types of alerts and detections you want to look for will be different. And then finally, as I mentioned, the talent. So just that sort of sets the stage of both what is it and what are the challenges to dealing with it. So what's our context for today? As I mentioned, we've been at this helping both program these industrial controls, operating technology type systems for almost 30 years. And so we've been working in this space with clients trying to achieve OT security for a long time. Our cybersecurity development team comes out of the IT world. So folks who sort of lived and breathed all of the traditional IT security methodologies. And what we've learned from this, bringing together these capabilities, is that the real way to achieve OT security needs to be by bringing many of those same IT type capabilities into an OT environment. And so we've tried to build that, et cetera. But what we're trying to share today is some of our experiences from both our consulting as well as working with clients on these environments. So we've sort of seen the movie, I guess, is the best way of putting this. What do we hear? We often hear from clients a range of different topics. So first, you can't do the same security in OT as you do in IT. So it's too old, it's too sensitive, et cetera. OT resources don't really get security. They're all PLCs, DCS, alarms, et cetera. They really don't understand what security is all about. I want to have one SOC and just add OT to it. So I'm just going to have an IT solution just forward me all that OT stuff into my IT SOC and all will be good. And a variety of things. OEM vendors are responsible. From the OT folks, you often hear that IT has somehow screwed up their system in the past and they don't want to talk to them, and cultural differences. So there's a number of these challenges that we hear from clients in this space as we begin to talk with them. At the same time, there is a growing pressure on chief information security officers and IT security in general to address this growing concern. And the growing pressure is coming from generally 4 directions. We call it RAID. First, from regulators. There is a growing regulatory pressure, and this is true in almost every geography and many industries. We're seeing Congress here in the US start to put more pressure on the regulatory bodies to address critical infrastructure protection. If you look overseas, it's increasing. And even the regulations that exist are becoming more stringent, like NERC-CIP and others. The attackers. So we are seeing a significant growth in the attack frameworks within the OT environment. So there was about a 45% increase in OT vulnerabilities in 2020, and over 75% of those were discovered by third parties. And in some ways, that's great news. People are starting to research these and publish these vulnerabilities so vendors can publish patches, et cetera. The reality is that we're behind. that as these things are being discovered by third parties, at the same time, there's lots of these vulnerabilities being discovered that aren't being publicized. And so we're seeing an increase in attacks and particularly ransomware. The insurers, as most of you who are paying for insurance are seeing, the cybersecurity insurance rates are definitely firming up. And more of those insurers are realizing that there is this other side of the IP stack in the world of OT, and there are now sort of driving boards and CISOs to look at those things. And then finally, the data requirements, meaning this shift to IIoT is really essentially blowing up the myth of the air gap. It really didn't exist before, but to the extent there was some potential truth somewhere to it that these OT systems were separated from the IT world. Once you start bringing in Industry 4.0, et cetera, those air gaps, as it were, really start to go away. And so therefore, this topic is becoming a much more critical focus for many CISOs. So just a couple of double clicks on that, the risks that are growing. So there were almost 250 industrial control system advisories from CISA last year. That was about a 30% increase. The average risk score of those, CVSS score of those vulnerabilities was an 8, which is a 40% increase in critical advisories. So a 30% increase roughly in total advisories, 40% in critical, and almost a 50% increase in the total number of actual underlying vulnerabilities. So advisories up by a third. Each of those advisories includes, roughly 2.5 actual CVEs, and the scores of those are going up. And we're seeing it already in 2021, right? WestRock, the big paper company, got hit by ransomware. German glass manufacturer was hit with ransomware. Both of those likely tied into the vaccine supply chain. Molson Coors, Oldsmar Water, just more and more of these, and many that aren't publicized, where people are paying the ransoms and not publicizing it. These are not new, so this is just I guess a quick summary of the various attacks that have impacted the OT side of things over the last, call it 20 years or so, and these are just the kind of the famous ones, or whatever you want to call it. There's a whole bunch of these that were not on this list. The point is, this is not new. It goes all the way back to Stuxnet in 2010, or even before that, to a Marucci Shire, which is an environmental issue that happened. Stuxnet probably being the most famous one, where the US and Israel impacted the Iranian centrifuges to essentially cause Iran to have to slow down their nuclear weapons program. But then recently, with Honda last year, Norsk Hydro the year before that, et cetera. So this is not new, but it is increasing. And the financial impact of these can be massive. When you shut down production, not only are you putting sort of lives potentially at risk, depending on what happens to that system, right? It can blow up, et cetera, but financially, it's a major impact. And these are just a few examples. Even in the Norsk Hydro case, these folks were really prepared, and still it was $150 million impact. So in a way, we tend to sort of sweep this under the rug, but it's becoming a much more significant risk. But there are different types, right? So as we think about OT risks, we start with the top, which is what we refer to as collateral damage. Many of those on the prior page, the Mercks of the world, the Maersks of the world, it was an IT attack that managed to spread across into the OT world. Both both of those cases, NotPetya, WannaCry ransomware moved across. But then as you move down, you've got insider attacks, and then the ones that get talked about a lot are these more advanced outsider attacks, where APTs, foreign governments, the one that gets talked about a lot is the risk to our own power grid. The point is that as we think about how we're going to protect these risks, we need to think about all of these ranges of risk. It's not enough just to say, okay, I'm just going to protect myself against those specific advanced outside, very advanced threats. And, it really takes a lot of advanced thinking to figure out how I'm going to stop a PLC, or alternatively to change the particular outcome of a PLC. But in many cases, we have to stop the ransomware up at the top because that's a much more likely potential impact. Many of those, as I mentioned, bridge from IT into the OT side. So typical ransomware example is an entity implants the ransomware on that IT side using some form of phishing campaign, stealing credentials, et cetera. That ransomware then exploits vulnerabilities and it traverses the networks. In almost every case, and we're going to talk about this as we go, the networks separating IT and OT are either non-existent, meaning that the network separation between IT and OT are often non-existent, or if they're there on paper, but when you get into the actual configurations of those protections, there was weak ACLs, dual NIC machines, all sorts of things that allow that ransomware to jump across to OT. And then once you get into the OT side, as I mentioned, most of these systems are not managed, they're not patched. They have dozens and dozens of dormant user accounts, many of them with admin access. And so once it's in, it spreads quickly across that OT environment. And then finally, when you want to go recover, say, okay, great, I'll recover from my backups. But in many cases, again, because they're not strongly managed, you run into the lack of an updated backup. And so now you're back to sort of starting from scratch. And so this is just one example of how a threat to IT can quickly bridge and start shutting down your operational processes. Please, as we go here, if there's any Q&A or anything as we go, please feel free to jump in.
Hey, John, we do have one question.
Terrific.
Bruce asks, so is, quote, isolation, end quote, good enough to protect OT?
Absolutely not, is our view. Let me talk through what isolation means in most cases. So we think of 2 or 3 types of isolation. Let's take the most extreme isolation, i.e. it's truly not connected to the internet. And what I mean by that is there is no network connection. It is physically a separate network. It's not behind it's not a firewall. It's not even a diode. It is truly separated. Even in that case, there are usually 2 ways that attackers can bridge that gap, 3 ways actually, that attackers can bridge the gap. The first is insiders, right? So somebody is programming those devices. And so someone has access to those devices, even if they may not be remote access, on-site access. So there's the insider threat. Now we can deal with that in lots of procedural ways. But again, that's the first problem. The second problem is the need for maintenance or other forms of updating of those disconnected, isolated, so to speak, systems. And there's 2 real means of having that happen. The first is remote access. So I've got some form of way of getting to that network through a jump box or some sort of remote access. So yes, it's isolated all the time until we do remote access. Or third, we send someone physically on site and they bring some form of transient cyber asset, we call it, i.e. a laptop, USB stick, something, where they bring in their updates, their maintenance software, whatever it is, and they use the systems there, or they bring in their laptop. The minute they do that, you are now connected to whatever they connected to. And so while being isolated is certainly, from a security point of view, better than not, right? You've cut out a lot of the threats. The reality is, even when you're quote unquote isolated, no one is ever really isolated. And so you get into the need for some form of protection, even in those isolated environments. Hopefully that helps give some perspective on that question of isolation. And there is, by the way, a whole spectrum of what quote unquote isolation means. What I want to do now is to talk a little bit about, okay, so that's the differences in OT and the challenges and the risks. Well, okay, so IT has developed a whole bunch of tools and processes and capabilities. And so how do we leverage those? And this is just one framework. Every organization is picking their own and how they do it. This is the NIST cybersecurity framework, and we've essentially overlaid the Center for Internet Security, top 20 security controls on that. But in a sense, if you applied pretty much any of the main standards, you get the same primary set of things, from identify to protect, detect, respond, and recover. And when we think about protecting OT security, there's, in a way, there's nothing different about the objectives that we have. We want to do the same things. We want to identify all of our risks. We want to protect the system with network protections and endpoint protections. We want to detect patterns of behavior that may be risky or configurations that may be changing without approvals. We need to respond quickly. We need to be able to recover from backups if necessary, and the processes that go through recovery. So in a way, the roadmap is clear. We need to do these things. The reality is that in many cases, we get stymied in trying to achieve these things. And so what do we hear from Chief Information Security officers all the time? What they say is, okay, what I want to do is I want those same capabilities on that prior chart. I want to be able to do patch management. I want to be able to harden my configurations. I want to do user and account management, software inventory, all the things that I do in IT, but to do it in a way that doesn't essentially screw up the operations. Because I know maybe from past experience where we tried to run an Nmap scan on an OT network and we tripped a plant, or I know when we had IT doing our every Tuesday patching that we patched a system that caused the plant to go offline, or whatever it happens to be. Or maybe I don't know it from experience, but I've been told that we can cause damage. So we need to do these things on the left, but do them in a way that is operationally safe and efficient for all of those OT systems that we talked about before, which are different. And so this is the challenge that we hear over and over again. It's not enough to just do a subset of security. We need to do the same level of security on these systems as we're doing in the IT world. How do we do that? And so these are our, sort of 6 key points about how we think Chief Information Security officers, or whoever is responsible for this, right? The board, IT, et cetera. How do you achieve those objectives? The first is education and awareness. And we're going to talk more about this, but one of the biggest problems that we see organizations run into is a lack of alignment between IT and OT. There's a lot of historical reasons for this. There's cultural differences, et cetera. There's a lot of focus on plant operations and the plant having, in the industrial world, having authority, so to speak. And there's been issues in the past where IT may have tried to do something and caused issues. So anyway, the first is bringing the two together and having education and awareness on both sides of the coin. Number 2, beginning with assessing the environment and being prepared for some pretty major surprises if you haven't looked at these systems in the past, and we'll talk through more of that. Third, think vendor agnostic. One of the biggest challenges in this world, to be honest, is the vendors themselves, are the OEMs themselves. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is, in almost all of these environments, you have a lot of different OEMs, and those OEMs are running proprietary systems. And so what they're saying is, we will find a way to protect our systems. And by the way, you as customer, you don't touch my system. I put it in place. It's my software. If you touch it, it's going to screw it up. And what that leaves the customer in is a really tough spot, because I've got a dozen different control system vendors. I can't have a dozen different security system solutions. I have to find a way to be vendor agnostic. But there is a way to do that, but there needs to be a real push and effort against that. It's not as simple as it sounds. Number 4, build OT specific security skill sets, what we refer to as OT systems management. All those same functions on the IT system management or security management side, we need to build in OT. And to be honest, they don't exist. And we'll talk more about that. Next, think global, act local. What we mean by that is, this doesn't work if every individual hospital or every individual plant or every individual building has to have a security person responsible for cybersecurity at that plant. But unfortunately, in many cases, that's the way that OT thinks about its networks today, right? They have a plant IT person who runs that plant. And so as we think about this, we need to think global, and meaning we need to take all that data from the sites and we need to bring it up centrally, allow scaled teams to analyze vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. But then when the actions happen, when we go and remediate something, when we patch, when we harden a config, when we manage users, that needs to be done in a way where the local team can take final control over those actions so that we don't do something that might trip a plant, et cetera. And that think global, act local approach allows you to scale and drive lower total cost of ownership, but at the same time, make sure you're operationally safe. And then finally, bringing IT type capabilities from a technology point of view, but tuned into that OT requirements. So don't settle for half a solution, I guess, right? There is a way to bring IT-like capabilities, but into those OT environments, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So just as we get going here around how do you do this, a quick short case study here so that you know it actually is doable. So this was an example from a couple of years ago. We were working with a very large integrated electric utility, and they had decided, they had a whole bunch of government regulations on them, but they had decided they also wanted to achieve a level of security across IT and OT at a standard of the CIS top 20. So they took those CIS top 20 and they said, Center for Internet Security, by the way, sometimes referred to as CSC. And they said, we want to achieve a maturity level of X across every asset in the environment. And they put a deadline of a year. And they said, we want every asset to be at level X maturity by the end of the year. And then we need each asset to be able to be managed and maintained at that sub-control level. And in that case, they had all sorts of different OEM systems. And by the way, to do the CIS, it had to go a lot beyond basic network detection. And so what they did is they built a program and they said, okay, we're going to do this risk assessment on all the assets. We're going to look at every single asset and we're going to understand against the CIS top 20, where do we stand? They built a close alignment between those IT and OT teams where every other week they reviewed the outcomes on each plant or each asset. They had essentially a set of remediation actions, particularly around compensating controls. So in many cases in these environments, you can't, for instance, CIS says you have to have antivirus. Well, you can't have antivirus on a PLC. There's no way to do antivirus today on a PLC. So there has to be some compensating control you put in place to deal with that. And then finally, they built this OT systems management team with local actionability. And in doing these things, they were able to have a dramatic increase in their maturity. They achieved their goal of the level of maturity they wanted to against every one of the CIS controls within a year. They had all these compensating controls, every one of them documented, and then they could measure how they were doing on those compensating controls. And so, in short, they took that approach that I laid out before, and they executed that, and they were able to achieve this within about a year, a dramatic increase. Now, in their maturity. Now, this was not a small effort. Don't get me wrong, but the point is that it was a management-driven outcome where they said, we're going to do this, and they put all of the processes in place to do it, which, by the way, then enables them to do things like IIoT and other things in a more advanced way because they know they're secure from doing so.
Hey, John, there's another question from the audience.
Yep.
Robert asks, question on the utility's desire for CIS compliance.
Yep.
What CIS implementation group was the target, 1 or 2?
So they did, to make sure I'm understanding the question, I believe when you say implementation group, there are 3 implementation groups, I think, in what your questions is. The first, I think it's the first 6 controls, then it's the next, which I think are called basic. The next are called maturing, if I recall, and there's like 10 controls in there, and then the last 4 are the next level. And so, yes, sir, he says. So they actually looked at every one of those controls. So they were looking at 171 subcontrols. Now, in some cases, like I said, with a programmable logic controller, for instance, you couldn't do sub-control, whatever it was, 3 dot whatever, 2 dot whatever, that says you need to have antivirus on that, I guess it's 8, whatever the number is. And so they said, okay, for that, there's a compensating control. So, okay, we're not going to have antivirus, but the way we're going to address that is through another CIS control, like for instance, network protection. And so any device that doesn't have antivirus needs to have a application firewall sitting in front of it on the Windows box in front of it. It needs to have no insecure communications to that device. So all telnet and that sort of thing needs to be shut off. I can run down the list, but essentially a set of compensating controls that needed to be monitored and measured for that. But they were doing everything at once. It was a pretty aspirational goal. And so, as I mentioned before, the first step of this, so I'll go back to, how do you do this? So the first step is education and awareness, building that alignment. And so having IT and OT start to understand each other. And the way we think about this is IT can help by quote unquote defining the destination. Okay, so what are the desired outcomes? As I mentioned before in that example, right? This is what our outcome is. This is what our goal is. Educating on these requirements. I think one of the biggest challenges we have on the OT side is people just don't understand why this is important until they're impacted. And so laying those requirements out. So why do I need to do patching? Why do I need to do configuration hardening? And then communicating those policies, explaining the why behind this, not just the what. On the OT side then, explaining the technology side, making sure that the IT colleagues, understand the issues that they're dealing with. And a lot of this comes down to communication, bringing IT folks out into the plants to see the realities of an environment that runs, at 5 nines reliability. What are the devices? What are those operational requirements? When we need to patch something, here's all the steps that we need to take to do that. When you want to go and change, for instance, the firewalls in my plant, here's all the impacts that has on me from an operational point of view. So creating that awareness and then coming together as IT and OT to build that aligned roadmap. What are going to be, as I mentioned, those exception policies and procedures? What are going to be the compensating controls, and what define the rules of the different tools, right? Because in many cases, IT says, well, I got a whole set of tools that I've been working on for the last 5-10 years, we're just going to apply those. And so the ability to come together and say, okay, some of those work, some of those don't, and here's how the pieces need to fit together.
Hey, John, there are a couple more questions.
Fire away. Mm-hmm.
George asks, what tends to be more successful as a first step in creating an OT security strategy? Teaching OT department employees cybersecurity or teaching IT employees OT concepts?
Our view is that you need a little bit of both, and I hate answering those questions like that. I know it gets frustrating to hear you say it's both, but let me describe why it is both. So I think it's very difficult to take someone from the IT side and train them in the process controls of how do you make steel, or the process controls of how does a train operate using SCADA, et cetera. By the same token, many of those skills that the IT folks have of, okay, how do I deal with configuration management? How do I deal with patch management, user and access control? All those things are equally applicable into the OT side. And so our view is what we need to do is we need to give IT folks at least some awareness of the OT environment, but then bring OT people in to help them hand in hand make those things happen. I don't think it's fair to say that we're going to end up in a world where IT just learns all the OT and we don't need to have OT involved in security. I think, on the other hand, by the way, trying to train OT folks on, okay, all about Windows admin, it takes X number of years to learn all of those things. And so our view is you need to actually leverage each group for what they're good at. And you have a Venn diagram in the middle of 20% overlap or 30% overlap. but it's heavily, bringing the two sides together. Hope that answers. I'm sorry to be a cop out of a little bit of both, but I think it's unfortunately the right answer.
And then there's another question, John. What are you seeing from the vendor industry side in terms of supporting security configurations in their OT-enabled products? Any progress?
Yes, there's a lot of progress. Although in the pace of these types of systems, I think if you look at, let me think of a range here. So if you look in the world of IoT, like the true IoT stuff, cameras and sensors and that sort of thing, things that are really, kind of come out of the IT side, I think there's much more recognition of this and adoption of a lot of configuration standards on these new devices that are going in. As you move more towards, I'll call it the industrial sides, the Schneiders, the Honeywells, the Emersons, the GEs, et cetera, certainly there's progress, no doubt about it, but they have this big legacy issue that they have to get in work, so that as they roll out new devices, not only does that device need to work with itself, as it were, but it also needs to integrate with the brownfield stuff that's been there for the last 20 years. And that integration challenge means that the pace of this is much slower. And then I'll go to the far end of the spectrum, which is those systems that are already in place. I mean, even if we went at breakneck speed for the next 20 years, in 20 years, we will have a whole bunch of devices still in place that have been put in 5 years before today, even at fast pace. And so as a result, we are going to have to deal with the legacy for a very, very, very long time. And so short answer is great progress, but it doesn't always solve the root problem, which is the legacy. Thanks for those questions, and please keep them coming in. Dan, I appreciate your jumping in because I can't see the questions and talk at the same time, so it's great. So I mentioned before that one of the first things you want to do is try and assess that OT environment. And so what I thought I'd do is just to lay out, this is a somewhat traditional long-term sort of common set of findings that we find as we do these assessments. So just for context, every year we're doing dozens and dozens of these cybersecurity assessments in OT environments. And we use our platform to do that. And we go in and we gather all this data. And, the first thing comes up is this, by the way, is the Defense in-depth framework. But basically, you look at the policies, and in many cases, there just aren't any. Right? You ask for the written policies and literally there are none, or maybe they send you the IT policies and then you ask, do you follow those? And well, no, because we can't. Secondly, if I go around the wheel here, the perimeter side of things, we always find things are way more connected than people think. I'll give you one example. A client of ours had a very critical part of their system, and they had a firewall set up in front of that critical part of the system because these were old legacy devices behind that firewall. But over time, what had happened was the operators needed to get access to those machines. On a Saturday, the system goes down and Fred's at home. Well, okay, we give Fred access. How do we give Fred access? Well, there's a server there that we're using to do antivirus updates on those systems inside. By the way, the antivirus updates don't happen all that often, but anyway. And so we have a set of servers that have been put in place with dual NICs and the essentially dual IP addresses, and they sit on both sides of the firewall. And so somebody can log into that server from one side of the firewall and go right around the firewall to do the programming of the devices that they need to do. So on paper, it looked wonderful, but in reality, the drift, rot, as people call it, unmanaged devices create these risks. As I said before, you will be surprised, might be termed shocked by what you find when I get to the endpoint side. Similarly, typically we're finding literally thousands of critical vulnerabilities on these assets. Most of the time, no one knows the assets they have. So we're discovering those assets for the first time in many cases. They might have a spreadsheet somewhere, but what's the particular OS that's on there? What are all the applications that are on there? Doesn't exist. And so one of the first things we do is we go and discover all those assets. But then when we look at them, the number of vulnerabilities is enormous. Not surprisingly, many of these systems haven't been patched, or frankly, they're just out of support. And then not beyond the patching on the endpoint side, you find, because most of these aren't connected to some sort of an AD infrastructure, insecure configurations, you got, whether it be, we got TeamViewer, or we've got Log Me In, or even WebEx, right? Because someone asked for a standard laptop for the environment, and it came from IT, and IT always issues the standard laptop with WebEx on it. I don't need WebEx on my HMI, but it's there, and it creates an insecurity. Anyway, a range of issues on the endpoint side. And then on the access control, user and accounts, I think, is probably the biggest one that we find. Every time we look at this, we'll see dozens and dozens of admin accounts on these systems that have been set up over time and that are dormant and sitting there. You'd never, you could watch the traffic all day. You'll never see these accounts. They're dormant, they're sitting there. But many of them share passwords with other accounts that are being used, and no one's seeing them because, again, the systems are unmanaged. And then obviously COVID has driven a huge amount of remote access. And so we often find essentially unmanaged remote access, as I was saying before on that one example. And so by doing this kind of an analysis at the beginning, and by the way, in doing this, back to the point about bringing IT and OT together, you have to do it without pointing fingers, right? Because in a way, no one's really been responsible. So it's not like you point the finger at the plant manager and say, oh, you've been doing that. No, it wasn't anyone's responsibility before. But putting this on the table gets everyone speaking the same language very quickly, because it's really hard to debate. It's really hard to debate when you've got a whole bunch of vulnerabilities with a 9 or a 10 CVE that are, where devices are remotely accessible, that you don't need to do something about that. Or you find a whole bunch of devices that haven't been patched for the basic things like WannaCry or NotPetya or remote code execution vulnerabilities, et cetera. So step one, assess the environment. I mentioned before about OEMs. OEMs are terrific in many ways. They are incredibly supportive to their customers, but in many cases they become a bit of a barrier to achieving what IT wants to do from a security point of view. They try to narrow the options to their own solutions. And the reason for that, there is some good reason for that, which is, hey, if you put a piece of software on that system, it could cause the system to be disrupted. And so the OEM says, look, don't put anything on there unless I tested it. And by the way, it'll take me about 9 to 12 months to test that piece of software. And so they say, but I've tested these pieces, this type of software, and it works. Problem is, it works on their system, but I've got a dozen different OEMs. And so I end up in this world of multiple security solutions, which really just doesn't work. The reality is there are lots of things you can do safely across vendors, and be happy to talk more about that. It's almost like a separate webinar. Bringing IT and OT together to find common ground, because the OT folks are often highly dependent on those OEMs. And so finding a way to understand where they're dependent and how we can support them is important. Setting those clear targets. So something like CIS being as prescriptive as it is, where it's not you can choose, but no, this is the control, and this is what level 1 means, level 2, level 3, et cetera, helps a lot, because then it puts a requirement out there and says, okay, you have to hit this. How are you going to hit it? And not surprisingly, a cross vendor solution, something that's vendor agnostic, can reduce labor costs by about 70 or 80%, because I'm not having to deal with all these different toolkits. Just one example in this. So we often do patching work with our clients in the OT world. And they'll tell us, oh, well, that's okay. I've been having the vendor approved patches deployed on my system, so I'm okay. And one of the things, what happens is many patches are not approved. The vendor, it's not because they're not approved because they will do something bad. They're not approved because the vendor just hasn't tested them. I'll give you an example, Adobe. ABB comes in, they give you their approved patches. There's no approved patches for Adobe, yet Adobe is on your system. Okay, but if all I'm doing is putting on the approved patch list, I then have all of these patches that have never been looked at. It may be completely safe for the system, and it has all sorts of vulnerabilities to it, but it's just not looked at. And so this is one of the issues when you get too reliant on an OEM as sort of the person who's going to be responsible for your security. So next topic around beyond the OEM side is then say, okay, what do we, okay, I got to have some of this capability inside my organization. So the question that came before about, is it easier to train IT people in OT or vice versa? I think the important part about this is, what are we training them in? I think one of the things that our cybersecurity industry does that's a disservice is we tend to, we use a lot of fancy words or fancy names, AI, machine learning, you know, all of these names of these attack groups are this very arcane, funky names that if you're not really in the industry, it just sounds like gobbledygook. And it particularly sounds that way, by the way, to folks who live in the world of OT. The reality, and so we get this buildup of, you know, if you're not a machine learning expert or you're not, you know, trained for 20 years in AI, you can't do cybersecurity. The reality is over 3/4 of the jobs in cybersecurity, and this comes from the CyberSeek database that from the US government, over 3/4 of those jobs are in things that we would think of as basically systems management, network architecture, device provisioning, identity management, patch management, configuration. This is not, I gotta be an AI expert. I gotta be, you know, threat hunting APTs from China. This is basic systems management. And so when we think about building skills, we focus a lot on helping OT folks with learning to apply OT systems management into their environments. It's a huge change, right? They're not used to doing patch management. They're not used to doing configuration management, but this is 75% of what needs to get done. Sure, at some point, you're going to need to add those more advanced skills. By the way, that's where you want to leverage your IT capabilities, where you may have the scale to invest in those things, or you already have. But on many of these areas, OT folks are going to have to be a part of that. You can't do configuration management on an HMI that's running a Siemens system without having the person that knows what it's running involved. By the same token, that's not rocket science. It's not like I need 10 years of training on how to do that. So we focus a lot on this concept of OT systems management. And then I mentioned at the beginning in what we need to think about, this think global, act local. And so this is our framework for how we help clients think about this. At the think global level is getting this data from the bottom, from the plants, from the hospitals, from engineering, whatever, up to the top. And you'd say, well, of course, right? That's logical. It is, but it's also heavily challenging. It's challenging because in some environments, those plant general managers control their information. It may be that those networks aren't really structured to send that data up to the top. It may be that the OEM's tools are only at a plant level and you can't scale them. It is critical though, from doing this, you got to get that data up to the top so that you can scale the analysis. Otherwise, you literally just can't find enough people. Then in the middle, we typically find for large international organizations, they want some sort of regional SME who can help on some of the problem solving around remediation at a local level. But then when we think about taking those actions, we have to automate them, right? We have to automate patching, automate configuration hardening, user and account management, et cetera, but automate with local control. And what we mean by that is, let's just take patching, right? All right, I'm going to patch these systems, but before those patches are pushed, the local team essentially pulls the trigger and says, okay, these systems are offline, or these systems are I have a redundant backup for them so they can run right now, or this part of the plant is offline so that can be patched, whatever it happens to be. Having that local control allows for operational resilience in the process. Again, another reason why it's not just as simple as saying, okay, I'm going to go dump all of my IT tools over into OT, because most IT tools don't really work that way. They need to be adjusted to live and work in this environment. And so based on those things, what's the current status quo? Well, the current status quo on the technology front is many people rely on network protections, as the question was around isolation. Don't worry about the endpoints. We'll just focus on the on the network side. They rely on their OEMs. A lot of this is done manually collect data on assets, right? No real central automated solution because you can't run Nmap, for instance, or you can't do scans. They don't touch the endpoints because, if it's running, it may cause disruption. And they may use passive tools because if I'm only analyzing traffic, I'm not going to disrupt the operation, et cetera. The point is there's a limitation, right? There's these barriers that have been put up that we need to find a way to break through. And so our alternative view is to bring IT and OT security management together into a platform. And so this is our framework of how we think about it, of having asset inventory. Asset inventory becomes the hub of the machine, so to speak. And it has the same fundamental elements of IT security in there. It doesn't just do network protections. It doesn't just do detection, right? It brings together all those pieces. Really importantly, it's an integrated platform. I think one of the things that OT folks struggle with when IT comes in is IT tends to be, it depends on the organization, siloed, right? I've got some team that looks at vulnerability management, separate team that may be doing configuration, separate team that runs the SOC. And I'm now an OT and I've got one person who's trying to deal with all of this. And not to mention the fact that I really need to think about a 360-degree view of that risk, and I'll come back to that, but basically a holistic view of risk, because I may not be able to patch right away. That platform needs to be, as we've discussed, vendor agnostic. So let me just talk about that 360-degree risk management. We think this is absolutely critical as you think about the risk. So I mentioned before the notion of these compensating controls, that if you're going to achieve the CIS, there are going to be some things you can't do. Forget the CIS for a second. If you want to address vulnerabilities, in most cases you patch, right? That's the way you deal with it, or you harden the configuration. But in OT, it may be 6 months till you can actually patch that system because you're not going to have an outage until then. And so by having what we call a 360-degree view, what we mean by that is understanding everything there is to know about that asset, the vulnerabilities, the patches, the configs, the user and account access, anti-malware status, what network protections exist, does it have a backup, how critical is the asset to the process. I can start to put a score to that asset, a risk score, but more importantly, I can prioritize which risks on which assets are most critical. I can then say, okay, I could remediate that risk with patching it, but if I can't patch it, what's the next best alternative? Okay, the next best alternative is let's make sure it's got no user account, unnecessary user accounts. Let's make sure it's got application whitelisting and lockdown mode. Let's make sure it's behind a firewall. And I can then take those compensating controls or remediating actions and improve my risk score without necessarily solving the actual patch problem until I can, in that 6-month window. And then I can also measure progress against that, which is probably the single biggest challenge that most of our clients we see have, that we try and help them with is, okay, you're all red today. How do you move from red to green? And this sort of having that information that comes together by putting these pieces together is key. So let me pause there. Just may end on one slide, which is this is possible, right? So this is one of our clients who over the course of the year, this is a different one from the case study, but basically took the NIST cybersecurity framework, measured themselves before the program, and then they went about executing an OT security program that leveraged a lot of this IT kind of capabilities, and they were able to essentially double their NIST CSF maturity. So we've got about 5 minutes. I'd hope to leave a couple more minutes than that, but hopefully we've got a few minutes left. There's some practical next steps. By the way, we'll be sending out this document so that everybody can have the document, but I want to leave at least a few minutes for any additional questions.
So John, Jasper asks, would you recommend using a managed SIM tool such as eSentai, Rapid7, Arctic Wolf to manage IT/OT security?
So I think having a managed security solution is really helpful. It depends on the size of the company, right? If you're very large, you can afford to have your own, and you have the scale to have your own. But for many mid-sized companies, having a managed solution is very good. The thing I would say for those particular solutions is make sure that the data that you're getting into those solutions, and frankly, then the actions that you're taking are our true OT information, and you're getting all the way to those endpoints, right? So oftentimes what we see in those is, it's great, I get you know, some syslog data from some of the Windows devices. Okay, that's helpful, but what about all of the alarm data from the DCS? What about the behavioral data on those PLCs and networking devices in the OT environment? And so one of the things we say is just make sure the information flowing into that is getting you what you need from a security point of view. Any other questions that folks have at this point? Doesn't look like it. So let me just end with some of these practical next steps. So as I mentioned, bringing the OT and IT team together, assess whether it be a plant, we could sub in here a hospital, it could sub in here a buildings, regardless, right? An environment, we'll call it, using this asset-based assessment that we've talked about. In parallel, we think then, you know, starting to establish those standard policies and procedures, the objective function, so to speak, of what you're trying to achieve, build that roadmap, take one site, group of sites, and execute the remediation. Go fix it first. Learn the challenges, learn how IT and OT can work together, document that, and then you can accelerate it across the rest of the fleet. That's what we've seen work in other situations. So I hope this was helpful. I hope folks learned a little bit about OT and OT security and how at least what we've seen work for our customers in dealing with these challenges. And thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It was a wonderful presentation. I know looking at a lot of the questions that our attendees asked, it was something that was extremely informative to them. And to our audience, feel free to reach out to John and his team and Megan as well. If you want a copy of the presentation, as John mentioned, he'll send it out. And I've also had the good fortune to connect with John and Megan at Verve Industrial, and I can firmly say these are high integrity individuals that look to help others. We're blessed to have them in our community. So we thank them for their participation, their sponsorship of this. And again, to all of you that were on today's webinar, if I can be of help to you during these challenging times, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And you can also view some of our upcoming events at campconferences.com, both our full day events, as well as our webinars and boardrooms. We thank everyone for joining us. We hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll see a lot of you in person. Thank you again, John, Megan, and everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
See you soon.
Thanks so much.